talk about justification, they're thinking initial conversion and how you're initially forgiven. And if you tell someone, well, Catholics believe we're justified by faith and works, what that will mean to a typical Protestant is Catholics think you have to do good works in order to come to God and be forgiven. And actually, that is not Catholic teaching. That is the opposite of Catholic teaching. The Council of Trent, for example, says explicitly that nothing that precedes justification, whether faith or works, merits the grace of justification. So you do not do good works in order to get into a state of grace, in order to get into a state of justification. Good works flow from the state of justification.
Thank you for that clarification. I think that will be helpful for people. And I realize I probably, in that section of defining terms, should have added what is justification, and I really appreciate you diving into that a bit. To just press in a bit on that, so when the Council of Trent talks about that, we cannot merit our justification. When it says that, are we talking about initial justification here, or are we talking about justification generally speaking? Because you mentioned that for a Protestant, the thought is often justification is that initial kind of conversion, being put in the right before God, often with kind of legal overtones there. And for the Catholic, there is initial justification, which is by grace, prevenient grace, that we cannot bring about by our own good works. But there are layers to justification. Could you maybe explain those layers a bit?
Yeah, so the basic concept of justification, it comes from the English word, and the theological term comes from Latin roots. Justus means just or right, being in a right state. Righteousness is another translation of it. And facere means to make. So justification is to make someone righteous. And the question is, how does that work? What do we mean when we use those terms? And as you say, in the Protestant community, it tends to be used more for legal righteousness, so that God, before God's court, if you're, being judged by God, God is going to say this person is just, they're in a state of righteousness, legally speaking, and so they're not going to be punished, they're not going to go to hell, and things like that. The Catholic approach does not deny this courtroom type imagery. I mean, obviously, Catholics believe in the final judgment and the particular judgment that occurs at death, and so Catholics are very far from not imagining God as a judge. But the Catholic Church uses the term justification to include more than what is typical in the Protestant community, although there are variations on this, even within Protestantism. The way the Council of Trent defines justification, it includes both the forgiveness of sins and the transformation and renewal of the inner man by God's grace. So, obviously there's that language in Paul about, behold, everything is made new, you're a new creation in Christ. There's this transformational language. It's also frequently described in terms of sanctification or growth in holiness. And I would say exegetically, these two concepts, justification and sanctification, are sometimes distinguished, but sometimes they're not. There aren't rigid boundaries between them in Paul's thought. However, that may be, we don't need to fight about exegesis. Different people can have different ideas about what Paul means, as long as we're agreed on the substance. And both Protestants and Catholics agree that we are forgiven and we're transformed, and that we grow in holiness over the course of the Christian life. And it's just a question of how do our theological traditions sort of carve up the pie. What are we going to call justification? What are we going to call sanctification? And so from a Catholic point of view, there is this initial justification where you are forgiven and God makes you a new creature. He gives you his grace to do that. And he makes you righteous in that sense. He pours his love into your heart. And if you have the love of God in your heart, well, you are in a real sense righteous at that point. You may still have temptations but still, he's put his love in your heart, and in a real sense, you've become righteous as a result of that. But then, as you cooperate with God's grace over the course of the Christian life, that righteousness grows. It's like lifting weights. The more you exercise your physical muscles, the bigger they're going to get. And in the same way, the more you cooperate with God's grace and do acts of love, acts of charity, the more loving a person you become, the more holy you are, the more righteous you are. And so this would be described as a second stage or a second type of justification. And it's only in this regard that Catholics ever talk about works. You do not, as Trent said, you do not do good works to get into a state of justification. But obviously, we're meant to do good works. And as we do them, we are growing in holiness or righteousness. And so we are being further justified in that sense. That's how Catholics, talk about it. Protestants use somewhat different language, but they would acknowledge the same truth, that you're becoming a holier person as a result of cooperating with God's grace and doing acts of love for other people.
Yes, and I appreciate the way that you talked about it as carving up the pie, because I think that the language of justification and sanctification can be a real rub here, because we're sometimes working with different categories. So for a lot of Protestants, there's this really harsh distinction between justification and sanctification, and when they see language being used for what they would talk about sanctification being used for justification in Catholic circles, they maybe wince at that a bit, especially if it's not in the understanding that this doesn't have to do with initial justification. And my friend, Dr. Gavin Ortland, who makes content in these circles, he talks about this idea of mere justification and says, let's do recognize what we do agree on here in this initial justification. And I think maybe for Protestants that are interested in this conversation, they might be intrigued by looking into Calvin, and in his Institutes, he actually treats sanctification before justification. Talks about the duplex gratia and interesting things like that if people want to read further. But this brings me... Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to mention, I actually have a book where I go into all of this in rather a good bit of detail. It's called The Drama of Salvation. Yes. And I go into the different biblical terms and how they get used and how they overlap. By the way, just to document what I was saying about, I think exegetically there's not this rigid wall in Paul's mind. There's a very useful passage. It's in Romans 6, and I'm reading here. This is from the Lexham English Bible, which is an evangelical translation. But Paul is talking about our union with Christ, and he says, for if we have become identified with him in the likeness of his death, certainly also we will be identified with him in the likeness of his resurrection. Knowing this, that our old man was crucified together with him, in order that the body of sin may be done away with, that we might no longer be enslaved to sin. So the context here is very obviously growth in holiness, sanctification. We're no longer enslaved to sin. The body of sin is being done away with. Our old man has been crucified, and so Paul is very clearly talking here about freedom from sin. And then in verse 7, the way it's translated here and in most translations is, for the one who has died has been freed from sin. And that makes perfect sense in context, because Paul is clearly talking about being freed from sin. But when you look at the Greek, the word for freed is actually the word for justified. Literally what he says is the one who has died has been justified from sin. But the context is so obviously sanctificational, it gets treated as freed from sin. And so there is, I would say this is evidence that there's not this rigid wall in Paul's mind between the two concepts.
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. I think it's always helpful when we can see this in a clear example like that. And I remember the first time I had probably one of the foremost Greek scholars, he's actually not at Moody anymore, mention offhand that he didn't think the distinction between justification and sanctification would have made sense to Paul as we articulate it today, being really taken aback by that. But if people are patrons on my channel, they'll actually know that they have access to a paper that I've written on union with Christ and its relationship to the Ordo Salutis, and whether that's actually a helpful concept, which is a bit in the weeds, but if people are patrons, they can look for that, or if they want to see that, they can become patrons.
Cool.
But plug over. I want to bring up this idea of sola fide. And in your book, I believe it was Justification by Faith and Works, the 20 Questions edition, you were very generous in sending me multiple. I think I have these straight in my head. But in that book, you talk about the fact that Catholics can speak about justification by faith alone, but you also answer this question of whether they should speak about justification by faith alone. Can you speak a bit into that distinction and why you think that though justification by faith alone might be theologically viable, it may not be perhaps pastorally responsible, if that's a fair way of characterizing it?
Yeah, so the first thing to be aware of is that the term justification by faith alone actually has a place in Catholic tradition. It was used by some of the early church fathers. It was used by St. Thomas Aquinas more than once. And then when the Reformation happened, it got really grabbed by the reformers, and they started really highly promoting it. But they were articulating it in a way that the Catholic Church had problems with. The problem that the church had was not with the phrase itself, because it was already being used in the Catholic tradition. And so when you read Trent, and a lot of people misread it on this point, but it's very clear in many English translations, and it's even more clear in the Latin. But if you read the canons of Trent, when it deals with the faith alone formula, what it says is, if anyone says that man is justified by faith alone, so that he understands it this way, let him be anathema. And by the way, anathema does not mean damned by God. It means excommunicated. And so what it's doing is not condemning the formula faith alone, it's condemning a specific understanding of the formula faith alone that would strip it of human cooperation to where a kind of mere intellectual assent would be enough to justify you. Now, in the Bible, the concept of faith gets used in more than one way. There is a use of it that is basically just an intellectual recognition of the truths of Christian doctrine. James says that even the demons believe, but they shudder at the prospect of God's wrath, because that's not saving faith. It's just a kind of intellectual faith. Then there's another broader usage that includes trust, and you see this, for example, in Mark chapter 4, where the disciples are out on the Sea of Galilee in a boat, and it's storming, and Jesus is asleep, and they're afraid they're going to drown, and they wake him up, and he stills the storm, and then he says, "Don't you have any faith?" And he is clearly expecting more from them than just an intellectual belief in truths of doctrine. He's expecting them to be trustful of God. And trust is another way of expressing the theological virtue of hope, where we trust in God for our salvation. So you can, in addition to the intellectual type of faith, you can also have faith that includes the intellectual type and hope. But then in Galatians 5, St. Paul talks about faith working through love, which is what he says will count on the day of Christ. It's not going to be circumcision, it's not going to be uncircumcision, it's going to be faith working through love. And so if that's the type of faith you have, it incorporates all three of the theological virtues: faith, understood in the intellectual sense, plus hope, plus charity. And in the Catholic tradition, this type of faith has been known as faith formed by charity, or faith informed by charity. And that's the type of faith. If you have that, you are in a state of justification, because the only way you get God's love in your heart is if he pours it into your heart when you're justified. So if you have faith formed by charity, you are in a state of justification. And so you could, from a Catholic perspective, say, yeah, we are justified by faith alone, meaning faith formed by charity. And that was recently confirmed by Pope Benedict the 16th. In his audiences, he talks about how Luther's formula faith alone is true if you mean faith, the kind of faith is faith working through love. And so we don't need to fight about the formula. Obviously, we do need to ask questions about, well, are we agreed on the substance here? But the formula itself isn't a problem. But that doesn't mean it's necessarily the best way to express this. Now, after this became a slogan for Protestants, it made it really hard for Catholic authors to continue using this, because you couldn't use it. Everybody would know this is this Protestant slogan, and people, if a Catholic author were to just start using it willy-nilly, people would think, well, so what, is he arguing for Protestantism here? And it would be very confusing. So until the latter half of the 20th century, Catholic authors really stayed away from this, because it would be very confusing for people that they were trying to reach with their writings. But there's actually a couple of more reasons why this term may not be the best. One is that it's very easy for it to be misunderstood. You could have, you see this even in evangelical preaching. When you see pastors tell people you're justified by faith alone, they very frequently have to immediately start qualifying that by saying things like, now, we're not talking about just believing the truths of theology. Just because you believe Jesus died on a cross for you, that does not mean you're going to be saved. There needs to be more to your faith than that. And they may then start talking about trust as one of the things that's needed. But there's also a problem there, because they're not getting frequently to the repentance issue. And a lot of people would say, well, you can't really, now there will be different opinions on this within Protestant circles, but a lot of Protestants would say, an axe murderer who has not repented of axe murdering is actually being presumptuous if he says, yeah, I recognize Jesus died